Ethan Brooks believed the future belonged to people who built technology, not the people who quietly cleaned up after them. What he didn't know was that the woman he barely noticed would soon become the only person standing between his billion-dollar empire and complete collapse. The headquarters of Nexus Systems rose 42 stories above downtown Seattle, its glass exterior reflecting the pale morning light like a monument to modern innovation. Inside, thousands of employees moved through sleek hallways carrying laptops, coffee cups, and ambitious dreams. The company had become one of the fastest-growing artificial intelligence firms in America, valued at over $12 billion and celebrated as a symbol of technological progress. At the center of it all stood Ethan Brooks, the company's founder and CEO. At 47, Ethan was the kind of entrepreneur magazines loved to feature. His face appeared on business covers, his interviews generated millions of views online, and his opinions shaped conversations throughout the technology industry. Employees admired him. Investors trusted him. Journalists followed him. Ethan had built a reputation for seeing opportunities where others saw obstacles. Unfortunately, he had also developed a habit of judging people by what he believed they contributed to his vision of the future. Every morning, before most executives arrived, another employee entered the building through a side entrance. Her name was Emily Carter. At 38, Emily wore simple work clothes, comfortable shoes, and carried a small janitorial cart filled with cleaning supplies. Her brown hair was usually tied back neatly, and her calm blue eyes rarely attracted attention. She spent her shifts polishing conference tables, emptying trash bins, wiping fingerprints from glass walls, and making sure the headquarters looked flawless before important meetings began. Most employees never learned her name. Some nodded politely. Many walked past without noticing her at all. Emily never complained. She moved quietly through the building with practiced efficiency, always finishing her work before anyone realized she had been there. On this particular morning, the atmosphere inside Nexus Systems felt different. Large digital displays throughout the lobby counted down the hours until the company's most important announcement of the year. Investors from New York, San Francisco, and Chicago were flying in. Media crews were setting up equipment. Engineers rushed between departments making final preparations. Everyone seemed energized by the excitement. Everyone except Emily, who calmly pushed her cleaning cart through the executive floor while conversations about innovation echoed around her. As she wiped down a glass conference room wall, she overheard senior executives discussing the upcoming launch. Their voices carried confidence, excitement, and just a hint of anxiety. Billions of dollars depended on what would happen in the next few days. Emily glanced toward the glowing screens displaying company projections and timelines. For just a moment, something thoughtful crossed her face before she returned to work. Nearby, employees hurried past without noticing. To them, she was simply the cleaning lady. Invisible. Forgettable. A background figure moving through a world built by people they considered far more important. None of them could imagine that the quiet woman polishing fingerprints from the glass was carrying secrets that would soon change everything. And as the countdown continued above the lobby, destiny was already moving silently toward a collision that would leave an entire company speechless. By mid-morning, Nexus Systems felt less like a workplace and more like the control center of a national event. Every conference room was occupied. Large screens displayed live market data, investor schedules, and countdown clocks leading toward the company's highly anticipated artificial intelligence platform launch. The energy was electric. Executives spoke faster. Engineers skipped lunch. Even the reception staff seemed caught up in the excitement. Emily Carter moved quietly through it all. She pushed her janitorial cart across polished floors, collecting empty coffee cups and wiping fingerprints from glass walls that seemed impossible to keep clean for more than a few minutes. The executives barely noticed her. The engineers rarely looked up from their laptops. To most people inside the building, she was simply part of the background, another fixture of the office like the furniture or the lighting. Around noon, employees began gathering in the main auditorium for a company-wide presentation led by Ethan Brooks. More than 600 employees filled the room while additional staff watched from live streams throughout the building. Investors occupied the front rows. Cameras from major business networks stood ready to record every word. Ethan stepped onto the stage wearing a tailored navy suit and the confident smile that had helped him raise billions in funding over the years. Applause echoed throughout the auditorium. Emily happened to be cleaning a hallway near the back entrance when she noticed an overflowing trash bin just inside the room. Waiting until the presentation began, she quietly entered through a side door, hoping to remove it without disturbing anyone. On stage, Ethan was speaking passionately about innovation, disruption, and the future of artificial intelligence. Every sentence drew nods from investors. Every slide generated excitement. The atmosphere felt almost celebratory. As Emily reached for the trash bin, a technical diagram appeared on the massive screen behind Ethan. It showed part of the company's new cloud infrastructure. Emily glanced at it briefly. Her eyes narrowed for just a second. Something about the architecture caught her attention. Before she could stop herself, she quietly spoke to a nearby technician standing beside the wall. That backup pathway looks vulnerable if traffic spikes unexpectedly. The technician looked surprised. What? Emily immediately regretted saying anything. Nothing. Sorry. Unfortunately, the brief exchange had been noticed. The technician laughed awkwardly and repeated her comment to a colleague. Within moments, the remark traveled farther than anyone expected. A few employees chuckled. Someone pointed toward Emily. The distraction eventually reached Ethan himself. He paused his presentation and looked toward the back of the auditorium. "What is going on back there?" he asked. The room became quiet. One employee smiled and called out, "The cleaning lady has concerns about the network architecture." A ripple of laughter spread across the audience. Ethan raised an eyebrow. For a moment, he simply stared at Emily standing beside her cleaning cart. Then a smile slowly appeared on his face. "Well," he said, adjusting his microphone, "that is certainly reassuring." More laughter followed. Emily lowered her eyes and remained silent. Ethan continued. "I suppose that means we can cancel our cybersecurity department and replace them with janitorial services." The audience laughed even harder. Some employees exchanged amused looks. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Emily felt hundreds of eyes turn toward her. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, but she said nothing. Ethan spread his arms dramatically toward the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly why I love innovation. Everyone wants to be an expert these days." The room erupted again. Emily simply nodded once, picked up the trash bin, and quietly walked toward the exit. No anger. No argument. No defense. Just silence. As the door closed behind her, the presentation continued without interruption. Inside the auditorium, the audience quickly returned their attention to the stage. Outside, Emily stood alone in the hallway for a moment. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes drifted toward the glass walls overlooking the server floors below. Something about that diagram still bothered her. Something she could not quite ignore. And far beneath the celebration unfolding inside the building, invisible problems were already beginning to move through the company's network. The laughter inside the auditorium faded quickly for everyone except Emily Carter. Long after the presentation ended and employees returned to their departments, the memory of hundreds of people laughing at her remained fresh in the minds of a few witnesses. Yet Emily herself seemed unaffected. She continued her work exactly as she always did, moving quietly through hallways lined with digital displays and glass offices. If anyone expected her to complain, defend herself, or show resentment, they were disappointed. She simply returned to work. That evening, after most employees had gone home, the building settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm. The bright energy of the day gave way to the low hum of servers, cooling systems, and security monitors. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking downtown Seattle. Inside, Emily pushed her cleaning cart through the restricted technology floors where the company's critical infrastructure operated 24 hours a day. The server level was one of the few places she genuinely enjoyed. Unlike people, machines rarely cared about appearances. They either worked or they did not. As she cleaned around the equipment rooms, she occasionally glanced at the monitoring screens mounted along the walls. Most people assumed she ignored the technical information scrolling across them. In reality, her eyes absorbed every detail. Years of experience had trained her to notice patterns others overlooked. As she passed one display, something unusual caught her attention. A small spike appeared on a network activity graph. Nothing alarming. Nothing large enough to trigger alerts. Most engineers would have ignored it entirely. Emily stopped for a moment. The spike disappeared almost immediately. She continued walking. 10 minutes later she noticed another one. Different location. Same pattern. Her expression changed slightly. Not fear. Not panic. Recognition. She had seen behavior like this before. The cleaning cart rolled quietly across the floor as Emily approached another monitoring station. She pretended to wipe fingerprints from a nearby glass panel while studying the data reflected in the screen. Tiny bursts of traffic were appearing and disappearing throughout different parts of the network. Each event lasted only seconds. Individually, they looked harmless. Together, they formed a pattern that made her stomach tighten. Someone was testing something. Somewhere deep inside the system, an unseen presence seemed to be probing the company's defenses. Emily looked around the empty corridor. No engineers. No security specialists. No executives. The people responsible for protecting the network had gone home believing everything was running perfectly. She considered reporting what she had noticed. Then she remembered the auditorium. The laughter. Ethan Brooks smiling from the stage. The crowd treating her concern as a joke. Slowly, she returned her attention to the screen. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe the anomalies were harmless. But a quiet voice in the back of her mind disagreed. An hour later, after finishing her assigned tasks, Emily sat alone in a small employee break room. Rain continued falling outside the windows. She opened an old notebook she kept in her bag. Most people would have been surprised by what filled its pages. Instead of grocery lists or personal reminders, the notebook contained diagrams, network maps, security concepts, and handwritten observations. Years of accumulated knowledge covered every page. Emily carefully sketched the unusual traffic patterns she had observed during her shift. The more she looked at them, the less she liked what she saw. Whoever was behind the activity understood how to remain invisible. That alone made them dangerous. Across the city, employees slept peacefully, unaware that anything was wrong. Inside Nexus Systems, the countdown toward the company's biggest launch continued without interruption. Investors remained excited. Executives remained confident. Engineers remained certain their systems were secure. Only one person in the entire building sensed that something was quietly moving beneath the surface. And as Emily closed her notebook and stared out at the rain-covered skyline, she could not shake the feeling that a storm far larger than the weather was already approaching. The next morning arrived with clear skies and renewed optimism throughout Nexus Systems. News outlets were already discussing the upcoming launch. Financial analysts predicted record growth. Social media buzzed with speculation about the company's new artificial intelligence platform. For Ethan Brooks, everything appeared to be unfolding exactly as planned. He entered headquarters surrounded by assistants and senior executives, greeting investors and board members with the confidence of a man who believed he was standing at the peak of his success. Yet hidden beneath The polished surface of the company, small cracks were beginning to spread. They were invisible to almost everyone. In the Network Operations Center, monitoring dashboards displayed healthy performance metrics. Automated systems reported no major concerns. Security software continued generating thousands of routine notifications that engineers had long since learned to ignore. The system appeared stable. The illusion was convincing. Emily Carter arrived for her shift carrying the same small notebook she had studied the night before. Throughout the morning, she quietly observed the activity around her. Employees rushed through hallways discussing launch schedules and investor presentations. Nobody paid attention to the cleaning lady moving between conference rooms. That anonymity had become one of her greatest advantages. It allowed her to see things others missed. Shortly after lunch, Emily returned to the technology floors. As she cleaned near one of the server monitoring stations, she noticed something that immediately made her stop. The strange traffic patterns had returned. This time they were slightly larger. Slightly bolder. Still subtle enough to avoid triggering concern, but no longer random. Her eyes followed the activity moving across multiple segments of the network. The pattern was evolving. Whoever was behind it was becoming more confident. Emily felt a chill run through her. Years ago, she had learned that sophisticated threats rarely announced themselves. They whispered. They tested boundaries. They measured reactions. They waited patiently. And the most dangerous ones often remained invisible until the moment they struck. She glanced around the corridor. 2 junior engineers were walking nearby. For a moment she considered saying something. Then she remembered the auditorium once again. The laughter. The jokes. The assumption that a cleaning lady could not possibly understand technology. Quietly, she kept cleaning. But inside, concern continued growing. Later that afternoon, a brief issue interrupted operations in one department. Several employees temporarily lost access to internal files. The problem lasted only 3 minutes before correcting itself. Most people dismissed it as a routine technical glitch. The support team reset a few systems and moved on. Emily noticed something different. The disruption had occurred in the exact area where she had observed unusual network activity earlier. The connection was too precise to ignore. For the first time, she became certain that the company was facing something far more serious than a minor technical problem. As evening approached, launch preparations intensified. Teams worked overtime. Executives reviewed presentations. Investors arrived from across the country. The entire building seemed focused on a future filled with opportunity. Nobody was looking behind them. Nobody realized that a hidden threat was already moving through critical systems, quietly mapping infrastructure and identifying weaknesses. Deep inside the network, invisible doors were being tested one by one. Emily finished her shift but did not leave immediately. Instead, she stood alone near a large window overlooking the city. Thousands of lights stretched across the Seattle skyline. Somewhere beyond those buildings sat the people responsible for what she was seeing. They were patient, skilled, calculating. And they understood something that Nexus systems did not. Confidence can become a vulnerability when it blinds people to danger. As darkness settled over the city, the countdown clocks throughout headquarters continued ticking toward launch day. Executives celebrated progress. Engineers trusted their systems. Investors anticipated profits. Only Emily understood that time was running out. And with every passing hour, the unseen threat inside the network was growing stronger. Launch day arrived beneath clear blue skies and extraordinary expectations. By 7 o'clock in the morning, Nexus Systems was already buzzing with activity. Television crews positioned cameras throughout the headquarters. Investors filled conference rooms. Financial reporters prepared live coverage. Across the country, millions of people waited to see the debut of the company's revolutionary artificial intelligence platform. For Ethan Brooks, it was the culmination of years of work. The atmosphere felt triumphant. Large digital displays counted down the final hours. Employees exchanged nervous smiles. Executives rehearsed presentations one last time. Everywhere people looked, confidence seemed unshakable. Emily Carter arrived quietly through the same side entrance she used every day. Her cleaning cart rolled across polished floors while excitement echoed through the building. Yet unlike everyone else, she could not share their optimism. The strange network activity had continued throughout the night. The patterns had become more aggressive, more organized, more deliberate. Deep inside, she feared that whatever was hiding within the system had been waiting for this exact day. Shortly before 10 o'clock, guests filled the main auditorium. Ethan stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause. Giant screens displayed the Nexus logo while cameras streamed the event live around the world. The company's stock price climbed steadily as investors anticipated the announcement. Everything appeared perfect. Then it happened. At first, the disruption seemed insignificant. A presentation screen flickered briefly. Several employees exchanged confused looks. Ethan paused for only a second before continuing his speech. The audience barely noticed. But within moments, more screens began flashing. Internal systems started responding slowly. Messages failed to send. Access credentials stopped working. The confusion spread rapidly. In the operations center, engineers stared at monitors as alerts suddenly flooded their dashboards. One warning became 10. 10 became 50. Then hundreds. Network traffic surged across multiple regions simultaneously. Critical services began disconnecting from one another. Automated recovery systems failed to respond. The room grew tense. Across headquarters, digital displays went dark one by one. Conference room screens froze. Internal communications collapsed. Employees who had been smiling minutes earlier now looked at one another with growing concern. Investors began whispering. Reporters checked their phones. Something was very wrong. In the operations center, senior engineers rushed between workstations. Fingers flew across keyboards. Teams launched. Diagnostics. Nobody understood what they were seeing. The attack had already spread too deeply. Every attempted solution seemed to trigger another problem somewhere else. The system behaved as if an invisible hand had anticipated every defensive move. Ethan received the first emergency call while still on stage. His confident expression faded as he listened. A second call arrived seconds later. Then a third. Applause disappeared from the auditorium. Silence replaced celebration. The room felt colder. Behind the scenes, executives gathered around monitors displaying cascading failures throughout the infrastructure. Millions of dollars were suddenly at risk. Then hundreds of millions. Every passing minute increased the potential damage. The launch had effectively stopped. The company's most important day was unraveling before a global audience. Meanwhile, on a quiet technology floor several levels below, Emily stood alone in front of a monitoring screen. The patterns she had noticed days earlier were now fully visible. The hidden threat had finally revealed itself. Her eyes moved across the data with calm precision. She was not surprised. She was not confused. She was simply disappointed that nobody had listened. Above her, panic was spreading through the company. Below the surface, the network was collapsing piece by piece. And for the first time, the people who had laughed at the cleaning lady were beginning to realize that their experts might not have all the answers. The operations center had transformed from a place of confidence into a room filled with tension. Large screens that normally displayed smooth streams of information now flashed with warnings, outages, and error messages. Senior engineers spoke over one another. Department heads demanded updates. Outside the room, executives fielded increasingly difficult questions from investors and reporters. Every minute the disruption continued, the company lost credibility, market confidence, and potentially millions of dollars. Ethan Brooks stood at the center of the chaos, staring at a wall of red alerts. Less than 2 hours earlier, he had been delivering what was supposed to be the most important presentation of his career. Now he was watching his leadership team struggle to understand a crisis that seemed to be spreading faster than anyone could contain it. The confidence that had once defined the room was gone. In its place stood uncertainty. One cybersecurity manager stepped forward with a grim expression. "We isolated 3 affected systems, but the intrusion appears somewhere else every time we close a pathway." Another engineer shook his head. "It is moving through segments that should not even be connected." A third specialist pointed toward a dashboard filled with activity. "Whoever designed this understood our architecture extremely well." The room fell silent for a moment. Those words carried weight. This was no ordinary technical problem. This was something deliberate. Something planned. Something that seemed to anticipate every defensive action before it happened. Across the room, a team of outside consultants joined emergency conference calls with security experts from several major firms. Recommendations poured in. Firewalls were adjusted. Access permissions were changed. Entire sections of infrastructure were temporarily disconnected. Nothing worked. The disruption continued expanding. Every attempted solution seemed to create 2 new problems somewhere else. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute. The room went silent again when a financial officer entered carrying new projections. The estimated losses had already climbed far beyond what anyone expected. Investors waiting upstairs were demanding answers. Market analysts had begun speculating publicly about the stability of the company. Ethan looked around at the experts he had trusted for years. They were talented people. Intelligent people. Yet for the first time, none of them seemed to know what to do next. Several floors below, Emily Carter quietly continued her work. She pushed her cart through a corridor lined with server rooms while distant conversations echoed from nearby offices. Unlike the executives, she was not surprised by the escalating situation. The pattern had been visible for days. The warning signs had been there. Nobody had wanted to see them. As she passed another monitoring station, she glanced at the latest data. The picture became instantly clear. The hidden threat was not attacking randomly. It was guiding the company toward a specific point of failure. A carefully planned chain reaction was unfolding exactly as designed. Emily stopped walking. Her eyes moved across the screen. Within seconds, she identified something none of the emergency teams had noticed. A narrow pathway buried deep within the network. An entry point hidden behind layers of ordinary traffic. The discovery confirmed her fears and revealed something else. The crisis was still reversible. But not for long. Somewhere above her, another emergency meeting had begun. Executives were running out of options. Engineers were running out of answers. And although nobody in the building realized it yet, the one person who understood exactly what was happening was still being treated as if she did not belong in the conversation. The crisis entered its 4th hour. Inside the operations center, exhaustion was beginning to replace confidence. Empty coffee cups covered desks. Tired faces stared at glowing monitors. The steady stream of alerts continued without mercy. Every attempted fix seemed to create new complications somewhere else in the network. Investors waiting upstairs were becoming impatient. Reporters were asking difficult questions. The company's stock had already begun slipping as uncertainty spread across financial markets. Ethan Brooks stood near the center of the room, listening to another disappointing update. "We found the entry point," one engineer said. "No, we did not," another immediately replied. That was a decoy. A third specialist shook his head. We are chasing shadows. Every trail disappears the moment we follow it. The room fell silent. Nobody argued because everyone knew it was true. For the first time in years, some of the brightest technical minds in the company were completely lost. Then a junior network analyst named Kevin Miller hesitated before speaking. His voice was uncertain. There might be someone else we should talk to. Several executives looked up. Who? Ethan asked. Kevin swallowed. The cleaning lady. A few people stared at him in disbelief. Others frowned. Ethan's expression hardened immediately. This is not the time for jokes. I am not joking, Kevin replied. A few days ago she made a comment about the architecture during the presentation. At the time everyone laughed. But after reviewing what is happening now, I realized she noticed something none of us saw. The room became quiet. One senior engineer shook his head. You cannot seriously be suggesting that our solution is a janitor. Kevin looked uncomfortable but continued anyway. I am suggesting that she recognized the vulnerability before any of us did. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence felt strange. Uncomfortable. Because deep down, nobody could ignore one fact. Their own solutions were not working. Ethan glanced around the room. Desperation was beginning to outweigh pride. Finally he exhaled slowly. Find her. 10 minutes later, Emily Carter was cleaning a corridor near the server floor when Kevin approached. She immediately recognized the tension in his face. Miss Carter, he said carefully, they need you upstairs. Emily paused. Why? Kevin hesitated. Because nobody else knows what to do. For a moment she said nothing. Then she quietly placed a cleaning cloth back onto her cart and followed him toward the elevators. The journey to the operations center felt strangely symbolic. Employees moved aside as she walked through hallways normally reserved for executives and technical staff. Some people recognized her from the auditorium. Others simply looked confused. When the elevator doors opened, dozens of anxious faces turned toward her. The room went silent. Ethan Brooks stood near the largest monitor. Their eyes met for the first time since the public humiliation days earlier. There was no arrogance in his expression now. Only concern. Emily looked around the room. Massive screens displayed network maps, system failures, and emergency diagnostics. Within seconds she understood exactly how serious the situation had become. One executive crossed his arms. Another looked skeptical. A few engineers appeared openly doubtful. Emily noticed all of it and ignored it. She stepped closer. To the main display. Her eyes moved across the data. Then across another screen. Then another. Less than a minute passed. Finally she turned toward Ethan. How much access do I have? Ethan stared at her. Whatever you need. Emily nodded once. Her voice remained calm. Then stop making changes immediately. Several engineers looked shocked. One opened his mouth to protest. Emily raised a hand slightly. Every adjustment you make is helping the intrusion spread faster. The room went silent again. She stepped toward the central console and focused on the screens. For the first time all day, someone in the room looked completely certain of what needed to happen next. No one questioned Emily after that. The confidence in her voice had accomplished something that hours of emergency meetings could not. For the first time since the crisis began, the room felt focused instead of frantic. Engineers stepped back from their keyboards. Executives stopped interrupting one another. Even Ethan Brooks remained silent as Emily studied the network maps covering the giant screens. Her eyes moved methodically across the data. Every alert. Every connection. Every failure point. Within minutes she began identifying patterns that no one else had recognized. "This was never a direct attack," she said calmly. "It was designed to look like one." Several engineers exchanged confused looks. Emily pointed toward a series of system pathways displayed on the central monitor. "Whoever built this wanted you chasing the visible problems while the real objective stayed hidden." The room went silent. She highlighted a narrow sequence of connections buried beneath thousands of routine operations. "There." One senior cybersecurity specialist leaned forward. His eyes widened. He had reviewed the same information for hours and never noticed it. Emily continued. "The intrusion is moving through trusted processes. Every defensive action forced it deeper into the network, exactly where it wanted to go." Ethan stared at the screen. "Can it be stopped?" Emily looked at the clock. "Yes. But we do not have much time." What followed felt almost unreal to the people watching. Emily moved from workstation to workstation with calm precision. She requested access credentials, reviewed system logs, and issued instructions with complete confidence. The remarkable part was not how quickly she worked. It was how certain she seemed. Every decision connected logically to the next. Every adjustment produced immediate results. Slowly, the endless stream of alerts began decreasing. One critical service recovered. Then another. Then another. Engineers who had spent hours fighting the crisis suddenly found themselves following Emily's directions. Nobody cared about titles anymore. Nobody cared about job descriptions. They only cared that the network was finally responding. The atmosphere inside the operations center changed. Panic gave way to cautious hope. A few employees who had openly doubted her earlier now watched with astonishment. One executive quietly whispered, "Who is she?" No one answered. They were too busy watching the screens. Emily isolated the hidden pathway she had identified and redirected critical traffic away from compromised sections of the infrastructure. Within minutes, system stability began improving across multiple regions. Communication channels came back online. Internal services reconnected. Monitoring dashboards shifted from red warnings to yellow indicators and then gradually toward green. The room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, one of the largest displays refreshed. A message appeared confirming that the primary platform environment had been restored. For a moment nobody reacted. They simply stared. Then another screen recovered. Then another. Across headquarters, employees watched as systems came back online one by one. Conference room displays lit up again. Access controls resumed functioning. Communication networks stabilized. It felt as though the entire building had suddenly awakened from a nightmare. In the operations center, an engineer checked the latest diagnostics and looked up in disbelief. "We are back." Another verified the results independently. "The network is stable." A third shook his head. "I do not understand how she found it." The room went completely silent. Emily stepped away from the console and calmly folded her hands. In front of her, she looked less like the person who had just saved a multi-billion-dollar company and more like the same quiet woman who had spent the morning pushing a cleaning cart through the hallways. Around her, executives, engineers, and investors stood frozen in stunned disbelief. And for the first time since the crisis began, every eye in the room was focused on the one person they had spent weeks overlooking. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The operations center remained completely still except for the quiet hum of the restored systems. Engineers stared at their monitors as if expecting the recovery to vanish. Executives exchanged stunned looks. Investors who had been preparing for disaster now watched in disbelief as stability returned across every major platform. Emily Carter simply stood beside the console, calm and composed, as though saving a company from catastrophe was an ordinary part of her day. Ethan Brooks finally found his voice. "Who are you?" The question echoed through the room. Emily looked at him for a moment before answering. My name is Emily Carter. A few nervous laughs surfaced, but they quickly faded. That was not what Ethan meant. Everyone knew it. One senior engineer immediately began searching internal personnel records. Seconds later, his expression changed. Then another engineer looked over his shoulder. Then a third. The room grew quiet once more. This cannot be right, someone whispered. Ethan stepped forward. What is it? The engineer turned his monitor toward the room. Emily's employment file filled the screen. Beneath her current position sat a history nobody expected. Years before joining the company, Emily had worked as a cybersecurity architect on some of the most advanced infrastructure projects in the country. She had helped design defensive frameworks that were still studied by security professionals. Her published research had influenced network protection strategies used throughout the industry. Several certifications displayed beside her name carried a level of expertise that exceeded many of the specialists standing in the room. The silence became absolute. Ethan stared at the screen, then at Emily. For the first time since meeting her, he saw her differently. Not because she had changed. Because his assumptions had. Why are you working here? He asked quietly. Emily smiled gently. After my husband passed away, I wanted a simpler life. I stopped chasing titles. I stopped chasing recognition. I discovered that peace was worth more than applause. No one knew how to respond. The woman they had overlooked for months had never hidden her abilities. They had simply never cared enough to look beyond her uniform. Ethan lowered his eyes. The memory of the auditorium returned to him. The jokes. The laughter. The public humiliation. He remembered every word. I owe you an apology, he said. A very large one. Emily shook her head softly. You do not owe me anything. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. After the way I treated you? Emily glanced around the room filled with executives, engineers, and investors. People reveal themselves through how they treat others. That is true during success. It is also true during failure. The room went silent again. There was no anger in her voice. No desire for revenge. Only quiet truth. Later that evening, as reporters celebrated the successful recovery and investors praised the company's resilience, Emily gathered her belongings and prepared to leave. Employees who had never spoken to her before now stopped to thank her. Some shook her hand. Others simply nodded with newfound respect. As she reached the lobby, Ethan caught up to her one last time. Would you consider returning to cybersecurity? He asked. Emily smiled and looked toward the city lights beyond the glass walls. Maybe someday. Then she walked out into the evening air, leaving behind a building that would never see her the same way again. And as the doors closed behind her, everyone who had witnessed that extraordinary day remembered a lesson far more valuable than any technology they had created. Intelligence does not always announce itself. Talent does not always demand attention. And sometimes, the person everyone overlooks is the very person holding everything together. And that day, an entire company remembered what dignity looks like.